Sophie Bennett stood frozen in the bustling New York train station, the sound of rushing trains and busy commuters filling the air, yet everything around her seemed to come to a halt. Daniel Carter, the man she had loved with all her heart, the man she had built a life with, now stood before her with cold detachment. The words he spoke were like daggers, each one cutting deeper into her soul. "You need to understand, Sophie," Daniel said, his voice firm and emotionless. "Everything I've worked for, my family, my future, it's all more important than this, than you and this child. I can't sacrifice it all for something as fleeting as our love." Sophie's heart shattered as she tried to hold onto the fragile thread of hope that had once tied them together. "Daniel, please, don't leave us," she begged, her voice cracking. "You don't have to choose between us and your career. We can make it work. We need you. Our child needs you." But Daniel turned his back on her. He didn't even look back. His cold eyes held no remorse, only a quiet resignation. Sophie stood there, her hands trembling as she gripped the worn suitcase that held her and their unborn child's future. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I've made my choice," he said over his shoulder, his words echoing in her mind. With that, Daniel boarded the train, disappearing into the distance, leaving Sophie alone in the crowd. The train pulled away, and Sophie collapsed onto a bench, her eyes wide, her heart numb. She tried to hold back the tears, but they came anyway, unstoppable, washing over her like a tide. How could he do this? How could he walk away from everything they had built, everything they had dreamed of? Her world was crumbling around her. In the cold, impersonal station, Sophie clutched her suitcase tightly, not knowing how to move forward. Daniel had chosen his ambitions, his family's influence, over the woman who had given him her heart. And now, she was left with nothing but the pieces of a life she thought she had. Sophie couldn't stay in New York. It was too filled with memories of Daniel, too suffocating with the echoes of what could have been. She needed a fresh start, a place where the past could fade into the background. That's why she decided to move to Miami. Her first job was as a substitute teacher at a local high school. The work was exhausting, and the days seemed endless. Sophie spent her nights in silence, reflecting on her choices, her pain, and the future ahead of her. She had never imagined that she would be raising a child alone, but here she was, trying to make sense of the shattered pieces of her life. She didn't have time for friends or socializing. There was no room for joy in her heart, only the overwhelming love for her son, Liam, and the fear that she might never be able to give him the life he deserved. Liam was the only thing keeping her going. He was her world, her reason to continue each day. He was the embodiment of everything beautiful in her life. The spark in his eyes, the innocent smile that brightened even her darkest days, and the love he gave her without reservation. Sophie dedicated herself to raising Liam with all the love she had, making sure he never knew the painful truth about his father. She couldn't bear to tell him that Daniel had walked away from them. She couldn't bring herself to let Liam carry the burden of knowing that his father had abandoned him. She told Liam that Daniel had died before he was born, hoping that this lie would protect him from the truth and the pain. Sophie told herself it was for the best, but deep down, she knew it wasn't right. She felt the guilt of keeping this secret weigh on her every day, but she couldn't let Liam suffer. He was too young, too pure to understand the hurt that had shaped Sophie's world. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his rise in the business world. From the outside, he appeared to have it all: wealth, power, influence. But inside, something was missing. No matter how successful he became, no matter how many accolades he received, he couldn't shake the emptiness that haunted him. His mind often wandered back to Sophie and the child he had never known. He had chosen his career over them, thinking that ambition would fill the void, but it hadn't. Now, with every promotion, every new business venture, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his decisions. At night, when the noise of the world quieted and he was alone with his thoughts, Daniel couldn't escape the guilt. He thought of Sophie, of Liam, and wondered how different his life could have been if he had made a different choice. But it was too late now. He had burned those bridges, and there was no turning back. The months passed slowly for Sophie, and with each passing day, the weight of her secret grew heavier. But despite the difficulties, she carried on. And then, one day, everything changed. In the early hours of the morning, Sophie gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, whom she named Ethan. The moment she saw his tiny face, all the pain and sorrow of the past seemed to melt away. In his eyes, she found strength, hope, and a promise of a better future. Ethan was a fighter from the moment he was born. Sophie couldn't help but smile as she looked at him, his small hand gripping her finger. He was the one thing in her life that felt real, that felt right. He was hers, and she was determined to give him the best life possible, no matter the cost. In the quiet moments when Ethan slept, Sophie would often wonder about Daniel. What would he think of their son? Would he even care? She couldn't let herself dwell on that for too long. The past was behind her, and she needed to focus on building a future for Ethan. But deep down, she knew that she would never be able to completely erase the pain of Daniel's departure. It was a wound that would never fully heal, but she would carry it with her, as silently as possible, for the sake of her son. For years, Sophie raised Ethan alone, doing her best to shield him from the truth. She told him stories about his father, always vague, always distant, creating a narrative that kept him from the truth. She told him that his father had passed away before he was born, that he was a hero who had been taken too soon. It was a lie, but one that Sophie believed was necessary. She couldn't bear the thought of Ethan knowing the truth, that his father had abandoned them. And so, life continued. Ethan grew up strong, kind, and curious, excelling in his studies and developing a deep sense of empathy for others. Sophie was proud of the young man he was becoming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, someday, Ethan would ask questions. Questions she wasn't ready to answer. As Ethan reached his teenage years, Sophie began to notice a subtle change in him. He was no longer the little boy who depended on her for everything. Now, he was starting to question the world around him. He asked about his father more frequently, and Sophie felt the pressure building inside her. She had always known that this day would come, the day when Ethan would no longer accept the story she had created. But she wasn't ready. One afternoon, as they sat in their small apartment, Ethan asked the question that Sophie had dreaded for years. "Mom, why did Dad never come back? Why didn't he want to be with us?" The question hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the familiar lump in her chest. She had tried so hard to keep this from him, but now it seemed inevitable. She looked at Ethan, his innocent face full of confusion and pain. She knew she couldn't lie to him anymore, but the truth was something she wasn't ready to give. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice trembling, "your father, he wasn't the person we thought he was. He left us a long time ago, and I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I wanted you to have a better life, without the pain of his decisions." Ethan sat in silence, digesting her words. The look on his face was one of disbelief, mixed with hurt and confusion. He didn't understand. How could he? He had spent his whole life believing in the story Sophie had told him, that his father was a hero who had died too soon. Now, the truth was like a shattered mirror, and Ethan wasn't sure how to piece it all together. "Why didn't you tell me earlier, Mom? Why didn't you let me know about him?" Ethan asked quietly. Sophie didn't have an answer. She had protected him for so long, but now the truth was out, and there was no turning back. Over the next few days, Ethan withdrew into himself, spending more time in his room and less time with Sophie. She could feel the distance growing between them, and her heart ached for him. She had done what she thought was best, but now, all she could do was wait for Ethan to process everything. She feared that this revelation might be the beginning of a rift between them, a rift that she wasn't sure they could heal. The tension between Sophie and Ethan lingered for days after the truth about his father had been revealed. Sophie tried her best to offer comfort, but the distance between them was palpable. Ethan, still struggling to understand why Daniel had abandoned them, withdrew even further into himself. Sophie couldn't bear to see her son so hurt and confused, but she knew that this was a part of growing up, a part that would shape him forever. Still, she didn't know how to fix things. Despite the unease between them, life continued. They decided to take a trip to New York, hoping that a change of scenery might help them both heal. Sophie had always loved the city, its energy, its vibrancy, but this time, it felt different. As they walked through the crowded streets, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The weight of the past was pressing down on her, but she had to push forward. For Ethan's sake, she needed to show him that they could move beyond the hurt. It was at an airport in New York that the unexpected happened. Sophie was standing near the gates, checking their flight details, when she heard a voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Sophie?" She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and the world seemed to stop around her. She turned slowly, and there, standing before her, was Daniel. But this time, it wasn't just Daniel. He wasn't alone. Next to him stood a young man, tall, with striking features that seemed so familiar. His eyes were an identical shade of brown, and his face was a mirror image of Daniel's. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The young man was Ethan. The realization hit her like a wave, drowning her in a sea of emotions. Daniel's gaze shifted between her and Ethan, his face softening with recognition. But Ethan, standing beside him, didn't seem to notice the connection at first. He looked at the stranger with an expression of curiosity. "Ethan," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling, that's your father." Ethan's eyes widened in shock as he turned to face her. "What?" he asked, his voice shaky. "You mean that's him? The man who abandoned us?" Daniel stepped forward, his face etched with regret and sorrow. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I've made mistakes, but I want to make it right." Before Daniel could finish, Ethan stepped back, his face hardening. "You think you can just walk back into our lives after all these years? After you left us behind? You think it's that simple?" Sophie felt a pang of guilt and heartbreak. She had spent years shielding Ethan from the truth, but now, standing before them, the man who had abandoned them was finally here. And Ethan was angry, rightfully so. She reached out, trying to calm him, but he pulled away. "Don't you dare try to apologize," Ethan said, his voice rising. "You left us. You never looked back. Now you think you can just show up like everything's okay? Like nothing happened?" Daniel stood still, the weight of Ethan's words hitting him hard. Sophie watched as Daniel's shoulders slumped, his guilt and regret visibly consuming him. The silence between them was deafening. After a long moment, Sophie stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Ethan, please. Let him speak." Ethan didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on Daniel, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Why now, Dad? Why after all this time? Why didn't you come back for me?" Daniel's voice cracked as he tried to explain. "I was selfish. I thought I had to choose between you and my career, and I made the wrong choice. I thought it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't. I regret it every day, and I want to be a part of your life, Ethan. Please." Sophie felt the tears welling up in her eyes. She had hoped for a moment like this, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like the resolution she had imagined. It felt like a rupture, an unhealable wound that was reopening. The days that followed their encounter at the airport were a blur of emotions. Sophie, Daniel, and Ethan had gone to a nearby cafe to talk, but the conversation had been anything but easy. The air was thick with tension, and every word felt like it had weight, like it could tip the balance between healing and further destruction. Ethan was still struggling with the revelation that Daniel was his father. He didn't know how to process it. All these years, Sophie had kept him in the dark, and now, suddenly, here was this man claiming to be the one who had abandoned them. Sophie sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching as Ethan and Daniel exchanged words. Ethan's anger hadn't subsided, but there was a new undercurrent of confusion. He couldn't deny the truth that was now standing in front of him, but he also couldn't just accept Daniel's apology. "How could you leave us?" Ethan asked, his voice raw. "How could you just turn your back on me? On Mom? On everything we had?" Daniel's eyes were filled with pain. "I didn't want to, Ethan, but I was scared. I thought I had to choose. I thought I couldn't have both, success and a family. I was wrong. I was a fool." Sophie looked at Daniel, her heart breaking for both of them. She had spent so many years carrying the burden of raising Ethan alone, keeping this secret from him. And now, here they were, finally facing the consequences of the choices they had made. But even as the truth came out, Ethan wasn't ready to forgive. He was too hurt, too angry, too betrayed. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know if I can just forget all this time." Sophie reached for Ethan's hand, but he pulled away. "I need some time, Mom," he whispered. "I need to figure this out." Daniel watched Ethan leave, a deep sadness filling his expression. Sophie could see that he was struggling too, torn between his desire to make amends and the realization that it might be too late. There was too much hurt, too much distance between them. And Sophie, despite her own pain, knew that she couldn't force Ethan to forgive Daniel. The truth had come out, but now they all had to find a way to move forward. And that, Sophie realized, would be the hardest part. The days following Ethan's emotional outburst were filled with a suffocating silence. Sophie watched her son, torn between understanding his pain and wishing for him to allow some space for healing. Ethan had withdrawn completely into himself, spending long hours in his room, grappling with emotions too complex to process. Sophie was heartbroken but understood his need for distance. This was a betrayal that cut deep, and the echoes of it couldn't simply fade away overnight. Daniel, or Michael, as he insisted now on being called, was equally struggling. After the encounter in New York, he had tried reaching out to Sophie, his messages full of remorse and regret, but she remained distant, unwilling to engage in conversation about their fractured past. She knew that Michael was truly sorry, but the wounds were too fresh, the pain of his abandonment too raw. She couldn't just forgive him after everything that had happened. After all the years she had spent raising Ethan alone. It was only after a few weeks of silence that Michael decided to take action. He couldn't let his son live with this anger. He needed to make things right, even if it meant going through the hardest part of his life, begging for forgiveness. Michael reached out to Ethan, first through messages and then with letters, detailing his regret and the pain he carried from his past decisions. At first, Ethan ignored him, refusing to read the letters. But over time, the barrage of heartfelt words from his father became too overwhelming to dismiss entirely. Ethan began to read the letters in private, each one a mix of sorrow, explanation, and a plea for a chance at redemption. Though the anger still burned inside him, something in Michael's words began to chip away at his resentment. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in the quiet of his room, he read another letter from Michael. It was filled with admissions of guilt, with Michael confessing how selfish he had been. He wrote, "I know I can't undo the years I lost with you, but I want to be a part of your life now. I can't promise I'll be the perfect father, but I promise I'll try to be the man you deserve. Please, Ethan, give me a chance to prove myself to you." Ethan sat in stunned silence, the weight of his father's words sinking in. The letter didn't excuse the past, but it showed vulnerability, a rare thing for a man who had been so determined to climb to the top, no matter the cost. Slowly, a small seed of doubt began to form inside Ethan's heart. Could he allow himself to trust the man who had abandoned him all those years ago? After days of internal struggle, Ethan finally approached Sophie. "Mom," he said, his voice shaky but determined, "I've been reading Dad's letters. I'm not sure what to do with them, but I want to see him. I think he deserves a chance to explain himself in person." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. She hadn't expected this. She had hoped that Ethan would remain distant from Michael, that he would protect himself from further pain. But seeing the determination in his eyes, Sophie realized that Ethan needed to face this head-on. She couldn't keep shielding him forever. "Are you sure?" Sophie asked softly. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Ethan nodded, his eyes steady. "I'm not sure I'll forgive him, but I need to hear him out. I need to know if he's really changed." Sophie took a deep breath, fighting back the emotions that swirled within her. She knew this was a turning point for Ethan. As much as she wanted to keep him safe, she couldn't stand in the way of his own healing. "All right," she said quietly, "but you don't have to do this alone. We'll go together." The decision was made. The first step toward reconciliation had been taken. Ethan was ready to see Michael, but the road to forgiveness would be long and uncertain. The day of the meeting arrived, and Sophie was filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She had agreed to accompany Ethan to Michael's place, knowing it was the right thing to do, even if it meant confronting the past head-on. They had arranged to meet at a cafe in the heart of the city, a neutral ground where they could sit and talk without the overwhelming pressure of being in one of their homes. It was a place where no one would be forced to face memories too painful to confront. When they arrived, Michael was already there, waiting at a corner table. His once confident posture was now slumped, and his face was drawn with exhaustion. He had changed, physically, emotionally. The weight of the years of regret had aged him, but there was also a vulnerability in his eyes that Sophie hadn't seen before. He had always been a man of control, someone who held power over his environment, but now he seemed smaller, diminished by the consequences of his past actions. Ethan stood still at the entrance for a moment, sizing up his father. Sophie could feel the tension radiating from him as he hesitated. After all these years, this moment was more than just a reunion. It was a reckoning. "Go ahead," Sophie whispered, giving Ethan a gentle push toward the table. Ethan nodded, his face determined but his eyes betraying a trace of uncertainty. He walked slowly to the table, and Michael stood up to greet him, his hands trembling. Sophie watched from a distance, her heart in her throat. She wanted to be strong for both of them, but this moment was beyond her control. "Ethan," Michael said softly, his voice raw. Ethan cut him off, his tone sharp. "I don't want to hear excuses, Dad. You left. That's the truth. You abandoned us, and now you're asking for forgiveness. But I don't know if I can give it to you." Michael swallowed hard, nodding in understanding. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I never will. But all I ask is for the chance to show you that I'm not the same person I was before." Sophie stood at the edge of the table, her heart aching as she watched the two men face each other. She had spent years protecting Ethan from this moment, but now she could only watch as he made his own decision. Ethan's gaze shifted between Michael and Sophie, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know what to believe yet, but I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to see if you're telling the truth." Michael nodded gratefully, tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you, Ethan. That's all I can ask for." Sophie let out a long breath, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. This was just the beginning of a long journey, a journey of rebuilding trust, of healing wounds that might never fully close. But it was a start, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, the dynamic between Michael, Sophie, and Ethan began to shift, slowly but steadily. Michael had shown up for every meeting, every conversation, never once giving up on his attempts to redeem himself. He continued to write letters, but now they were accompanied by actions. He'd offered to support Ethan's education, paid for his tuition fees, and made sure he had every opportunity to succeed. Michael showed up at Ethan's school events, quietly sitting in the back, never imposing, but always present, always trying to prove that he could be trusted, even if he couldn't undo the years he had missed. At first, Ethan had been cautious, reluctant to open up. He accepted Michael's help, but kept him at arm's length. He wanted to believe that his father had changed, but the scars left by abandonment ran deep. Every time he saw Michael, the man who had once been a distant figure, now trying to be a part of his life, Ethan couldn't help but feel the ache of everything they had lost. One evening, after a long day of studying, Ethan and Sophie sat down at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Ethan had become more reflective in recent days, and Sophie noticed a subtle change in him, a willingness to engage, a slight softening of the hardness that had once consumed him. "Mom, do you think it's possible to forgive someone like him?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice low. Sophie set down the glass she had been holding, her gaze softening. "I think forgiveness is a personal choice, Ethan. You don't have to forgive him for me, or anyone else. You have to forgive him for yourself, if that's what you need to do." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. "I know, but it's hard. It feels like I'm letting him off the hook, you know? Like everything he did just disappears." Sophie smiled faintly, her own heart heavy with the past. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or pretending it didn't happen. It's about releasing the hold that anger has on you. It's about moving forward, not for him, but for your own peace of mind. The next day, Ethan met with Michael at a cafe, the same one where they had first confronted each other weeks earlier. Michael was already waiting when he arrived, and as soon as he saw his son, he stood up, the hope in his eyes impossible to miss. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, what answer he needed to find, but he knew that this meeting would determine whether or not he could truly forgive. Ethan took a seat across from Michael, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy, but it was also a space for both of them to breathe, to process. "How have you been?" Michael finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, careful. Ethan shrugged, his gaze fixed on his hands. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About you, about what you did, and about what you're trying to do now." "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to know that I regret everything. I regret not being there for you, for Sophie, for the life we could have had. If I could go back, I would make different choices, but I can't. All I can do is show you that I've changed, that I'm not the man who walked away all those years ago." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He looked at his father, seeing the pain and regret etched on his face. It was clear that Michael wasn't the same person who had abandoned them. The man in front of him was vulnerable, broken by his own mistakes, desperate to make things right. After a long pause, Ethan spoke, his voice steady but uncertain. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad. I don't know if I can ever get past what you did, but I can't keep holding on to this anger either. It's eating me up inside." Michael's face softened, his eyes moistening as he reached out across the table, his hand trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'll be here, Ethan. For however long it takes, I'll be here. You don't have to forgive me now, but I hope one day you can." Ethan stared at his father's hand for a moment, then slowly, almost hesitantly, placed his own hand on top of it. The gesture wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. It was the first step, small, fragile, but real. "Maybe one day," Ethan said quietly. Michael nodded, his chest rising and falling with the weight of relief and sorrow. They didn't need to have all the answers right then. There was no magic moment where everything would suddenly be okay. But this was a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed. Months passed, and with each passing day, the relationship between Michael, Sophie, and Ethan began to transform. It was still fragile, still filled with moments of uncertainty and hesitation, but it was there. Michael continued to make his presence felt in Ethan's life, not just through words, but through actions. He made efforts to be involved, attending Ethan's important events, offering support when it was needed, and respecting the boundaries Ethan had set. The healing process wasn't easy. There were still moments when Ethan would pull away, moments when the weight of the past would crush him again. But there were also moments of connection, small, fleeting moments that showed that maybe, just maybe, the wounds could heal. Sophie watched as her son grew stronger, more confident in his decisions, and more at peace with his past. She knew that their family would never be the same, that the scars of abandonment would always remain. But she also knew that they had survived. They had come through it together, stronger than before. One evening, as Ethan prepared to graduate from college, he sat down with Sophie. He was no longer the angry young man who had resented his father for so long. He was a young man on the verge of stepping into the world, full of potential and promise. "Mom," Ethan said softly, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Sophie asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Ready to let go of the anger. Ready to move on. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive Dad, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm not holding on to the past." Sophie smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. You've grown so much." Ethan nodded, his eyes distant for a moment. "I think he's changed, Mom. He's different now, and I think I can trust him. Not completely, maybe, but enough." Sophie reached out and took his hand, her heart swelling with pride and relief. That's all any of us can ask for, Ethan. To move forward, to build something new. Later that evening, Michael came to the graduation ceremony. He stood in the back, watching as Ethan walked across the stage to receive his diploma. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He didn't need to be the one everyone cheered for. He was content simply to watch his son, proud and filled with hope. As the ceremony ended, Michael approached Ethan, standing quietly by the door. Ethan turned to face him, his expression thoughtful but calm. "You did good, son," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thanks, Dad." They didn't need to say more. The words weren't as important as the moment they shared. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. Sophie watched them from a distance, a bittersweet smile on her face. She had fought so hard to protect her son from the pain of the past, but now, she knew that they had all found a way forward. They would never erase the scars, but they had learned how to live with them. And in that, there was peace. The journey wasn't over, but it was a beginning. A new beginning for Ethan, for Sophie, and for Michael. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was enough. Years passed and life, in its quiet, unstoppable way, continued. The wounds of the past had not disappeared. They never truly would, but they had become part of the story that had shaped them all. Michael, Sophie, and Ethan each found their own way to move forward, to build something new from the remnants of what was lost. Michael had never fully regained the years he had missed, but with every small act of kindness, every attempt to be there for Ethan, he began to rebuild his sense of self. He had come to understand that redemption was not a destination, but a lifelong journey. It was in the everyday choices, in the steady commitment to change, in the quiet moments of reflection. Though his relationship with Ethan would always have its challenges, they shared something now, something fragile, but real. They both understood that healing took time, and sometimes, the smallest steps were the most significant. Sophie, ever the steadfast mother, watched her son grow into a man who was strong, independent, and compassionate. She had feared for him, held on to the hope that one day he would find peace. And she saw that peace beginning to settle in his heart. He had forgiven. Not completely, but enough to let go of the anger that had once consumed him. For Sophie, that was more than she had ever hoped for. Ethan, standing at the crossroads of his future, had learned the most difficult lesson of all, that healing was a choice, and that peace could only be found when you stopped running from the past and faced it head-on. He had learned to forgive, not for Michael, but for himself. He had allowed his father back into his life, but more importantly, he had allowed himself to let go of the anger that had held him captive for so long. One day, as Ethan stood at the edge of a new chapter, ready to take on the world, he realized that the most important thing he had gained through all of it was not his father's forgiveness, but his own. He had made peace with the past, and in doing so, had found the freedom to build his future on his own terms. As the three of them, Michael, Sophie, and Ethan, stood together, each with their own silent understanding, they realized that the past would always be a part of them, but it didn't have to define them. They had walked through fire and come out on the other side, scarred but stronger, ready for whatever lay ahead. The journey wasn't perfect, nor was it easy, but it was theirs, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the enduring power of second chances. And so, they stepped forward into the unknown, not as the people they once were, but as the people they had become. A family, imperfect but whole. A new beginning. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and for watching the video. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate every moment you've spent with us. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Your feedback and support help us continue creating more stories for you to enjoy. Stay tuned for more exciting content, and we can't wait to share our next adventure with you. Until then, thank you again, and we'll see you in the next one.